The Nature of Belief by Frost in the Warren. Chapter 6. And My Heart's About to Break. Past. Jack knew what he was doing. Despite how true the statement was, that didn't stop the trembling. Biting his lip, he firmed his grip on his staff and breathed deeply until it stopped. He knew what he was doing. He was tired of not being seen. He was tired of trying. He was tired of loneliness, of dreaming and wishing, and someday. But most of all, Jack Frost was tired of being tired. Hope hurt. Jack created snow. He made frost on the windows and icicles that hung on gutters and pipes. It was his to craft, to place, and to mold from himself. And so came the idea. With each smiley flake he made and each storm he siphoned off his magic, for it grew. Could he become what he created? In Jack's mind, the words reshaped themselves into harsher forms he dared not acknowledge. Could he disappear completely? Would he be eliminated in the process? Could he even die? And at the very center, quiet and sharp, was a single, What would it take to kill himself? Jack floated up from his lake center until the only thing he saw was the moon. He raised his staff and hesitated. What about Baby Tooth? Jack's entire mind drew back. Baby Tooth. His sweet, loving little friend. His best friend. Who he hadn't seen in over a decade. He'd make good excuses. She was busy. She had to be busy. Until 5 years became 6, and 6 became 7, and 7 became 12. That damn part of him that never stopped hoping, that thrived on someday, sobbed and begged that she was just so busy. Meanwhile, the rest of him condemned Jack to what he'd been afraid of since he'd met her. She'd forgotten him. Jack's resolve strengthened. She'd forgotten him, and he was tired, and he knew what he was doing. Jack closed his eyes and concentrated on calling up the storm he would use to spread himself. His magic came when he called it. A gentle ebb and flow along his arms to his fingertips channeled into his staff. Focused as he was hyper-aware of each drop of magic that left him through the staff. From there it radiated outward, dissolving to saturate the air and call the snow and ice. The storm formed around him until it was so thick he could no longer see the moon. He cut off the magic to his staff. Step 1 complete. Now came the hard part. Jack began spreading his magic to his limbs. It was thick and slow, a strange syrupy feeling beneath his skin. He felt heavy. His magic weighed him down, and were it not for the wind, he would have dropped like a stone. When every bit of him had been saturated with magic, he took a breath that felt like he was underwater. He opened his eyes for just a moment. Was he glowing? And then pressed his magic outward, taking everything of him with it. His loneliness, his anger at the man in the moon, his raw self-hatred. Jack screamed, and then exploded. The storm raged. Snow fell in white avalanches. Wind howled and stole the air from the lungs of the few unlucky enough to have been caught in its grip. Ice crept thick onto windows, and in the midst of it all, Jack Frost was carried along in thousands of pieces. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see, taste, smell, or hear, only feel. And all he felt was the rage, sadness, and loneliness, and the pain, so much pain. Was he screaming? He wanted to. He wanted to scream and scream and scream until the sound drowned the pain, but there was no sound. There was no screaming. It took 4 hours for the storm to die, for each and every piece of him to fall in tiny snowflakes that spread a patch of thick branching ice wherever they landed. Only then did they melt back into pieces that were pure Jack and blue with his magic. They converged back to Burgess Lake from miles around until they all came together and reformed Jack Frost. He fell to the ice at speed, bouncing where he hit and sliding across to the side. He hit the embankment. His muscles convulsed, the body spasming, 1,000 needles pricking under his skin. He opened his mouth to gasp. What came out was a watery sob. He was exhausted. He couldn't move. And he hurt. And with the hurt was a seeping realization that it hadn't worked. He watched the clouds above dissipate. Dawn was approaching. He saw the night recede until light had feathered across the sky in pinks and blues. He heard rustling. Feet crunched the snow. Someone was walking along the side of the lake, coming towards him. Whoever out of a blizzard on Easter. Jack whimpered as he turned his head. The Easter Bunny was approaching. Jack's lip parted in soft awe. He'd never met Bunnyman before, but he'd heard of him, last of the Pooka, subject of many an overheard conversation between spirits, guardian, and considered quite the catch. Oh, yes, he'd heard of him. But now he felt a twinge of regret as he saw the anger on Bunnyman's face. "I'm sorry," Jack said, and even his words sounded painful. "I didn't know it was Easter, really, I didn't." "Probably one of those wither sprites," Bunnyman growled. "They've never had problems messing about with others, and certain never minded hurting people." Cruel humour shadowed Bunny's face. "Goody Jack Frost isn't real. He'd probably only be good for making things worse." Jack wanted to deny it, but the part of him filled with loneliness, the part that had talked him into doing this, said otherwise. Bunnyman's voice became soft with grief. "If I find one more hurt child—" Jack's heart stopped for a moment. Hurt child? He'd hurt? He closed his eyes and began saying over and over, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Bunnyman passed by and disappeared into the tree line. Jack lay there for what must have been hours before he heard that familiar twittering. Hesitantly, he opened his eyes and said, "Baby Tooth!" The fairy raced into his field of vision. Worry lit her eyes, and as she looked over him, her face crumbled into sadness. It must have looked worse than he thought. She began crying as she clung to his cheek, pounding tiny fists beneath his eyes. She hadn't forgotten him. Relief warred with guilt. Words tumbled across his lips, and he hated that they sounded like an accusation. "I thought you'd forgotten me." She pulled back to look him in the eye, hers big and wet and sad. "No," her twitter said, "never." She came down and nuzzled his cheek. "I'm sorry." Tiny hands wiped his tears before they could frost his skin. As they lay in the snow, he understood he could never do this again. Not just for him or the children he'd hurt, but for Baby Tooth, who cared about him, who loved him. "I'm sorry, Baby Tooth," he whispered. She nuzzled closer on his cheek. His skin felt wet. "I won't do that again. I promise." She nodded, and neither of them spoke for the next few hours. Jack later discovered that Baby Tooth had skipped her work to find him when she'd heard about the sudden storm in Majesty. She'd be getting in a lot of trouble, but it would be worth it. For him, she made clear it would always be worth it. Before she left, she helped him find a replacement for his cloak, which had been torn to shreds by ice and wind in the storm. Looking through donation bins at the shelter, she picked out a blue hooded sweatshirt with a pocket on the front. He slipped it on and was pleased when it fit, only a little bit too big. The time between visits went back to normal. She was still busy, but she never let it get the better of her. And if it meant never seeing him like that again, still and quiet and pained, she'd skip if she had to. For him, for Jack, for her best friend. Present. The warren was like nothing Jack had ever seen. Flowers bloomed across the ground and climbed up the racks. Eggs skittered about underfoot, and the river sang with bubbling joy. This was a place where the very air smelled like colors and tasted like hope, but Jack explored. There hadn't been much else for him to do, so when he'd found the empty caverns, he hadn't thought twice about taking a look. They were homes. Barren homes for families that would never come, because Bunny was the last. He left them quickly. It was a good thing he had his smiley flakes, or else Bunny wouldn't have stood a chance against Sophie Bennet. It amazed him that the little girl had managed to get into the warren in the first place. North needed to keep better track of his snow globes. What if she transported herself someplace dangerous, like the middle of a desert, or the ocean? He watched Bunny and Sophie play and laugh. At least he seemed to have the sensibility to keep her away from potential harm. The river of coloring may not have been very deep, but there were still possibilities Jack didn't want to think about. He chuckled through his nose fondly. It was nice to see Bunny let loose a bit. He was always so stern and serious. Bunny's rare happiness made his thoughts stray briefly to the caverns. Bunny was so strong. How had he coped with being the last? How would he come to treasure the hope Jack himself was so quick to damn? But no, it wouldn't do to measure his pain against someone else's. He sat beside Bunny as the other cradled Sophie. "I really admire you," Jack admitted. Sophie snuggled into Bunny's fur, tired after playing. Jack wondered suddenly what it felt like. She looked so comfortable, and Bunny's fur seemed so soft. Against his better judgment, Jack reached out and his fingers passed through Bunny's arm. He drew back, a frosted blush on his cheeks as he realized what he'd tried to do. It was a silly idea anyway. Bunny'd made clear he had no positive feelings for Jack Frost, or at least the myth. He wouldn't want Jack touching him. But still, it had been a nice thought. It was decided that Bunny would take Sophie home. I'll just open the direct tunnel to our room and be back as soon as I can. Bunny adjusted the girl in his grip. I'll be quick as a bunny. He smirked. Jack laughed and followed along. He flew alongside Bunny as they raced to Burgess, appearing in the middle of Sophie's room from the tunnel. Jack watched him tuck her in gently, unaware himself of the softness his smile directed at them. He slipped a hand in his pocket and ran his fingers across the smooth wood of one of his most prized possessions, the carved angel. Bunny jumped back into the tunnel. Jack made to follow, but paused when he noticed an open window. He walked over to shut it so Sophie wouldn't get cold. Outside, a quiet twitter sounded. He froze. Baby tooth? Jack glanced at the closing hole in the floor. The twitter came again, desperate. Jack jumped out the window and the tunnel closed behind him. He followed the twitters to the forest, where they were louder and more frantic. He came to a stop by the rickety frame of a bed. Beneath, a hole dropped down into darkness. He broke pieces of wood away to clear the entrance and hesitated. Another twitter. This one pained. Jack dropped down.